Good morning, everyone. My name is Tracy Angwin. Welcome to this webinar on why payroll is so hard. I'm the CEO of Australian Payroll Association, and it's one of the questions I get a lot. So I decided to do a webinar on it. Who am I to tell you about why payroll is so hard? Well, I've written a couple of books on the payroll industry, the payroll revolution, and more recently, Profit from Payroll. And I've been in the payroll industry 28 years. In fact, I have no other expertise really. If it weren't for payroll, I'd certainly be digging ditches. So I think I've got some fair experience on why payroll is so hard. Now, who's Australian Payroll Association? I can see a lot of members on this call, which is fantastic. But for those of you who don't know, we are Australia's leading payroll training, consulting, and advisory association. We pretty much, I won't bore you with exactly what we do, but what we are about is creating confidence in how people get paid in Australia. And oftentimes when we come up with ideas of things to do or products to deliver to our members, we ask ourselves, would that create confidence in how people are paid? And if it doesn't, we don't do it. We've got some fantastic members and customers and students for our qualifications. And if you want to know any more about us, check out our website, and we've got 284 5-star Google reviews, which give you a bit of a feel as to what we do. Now, we've seen these headlines, everyone's seen these, and it's really when these headlines happen that I get asked a lot, why actually is payroll so hard? And it's normally not the payroll manager that is asking me that question. It's normally the person that payroll reports to, could be the CFO, could be the head of HR. Quite often it's the CEO or it's the board directors, and they'll say to me, really, I just don't get why payroll is so hard. Which is why we put this webinar together today. And I'm not going to be able to give you all of the reasons that payroll's hard. That's just impossible. But in the next 40 minutes, I want to paint a picture for you and your colleagues, if you choose to share this, as to what some of the reasons that makes payroll hard. Now, we have evidence around this from a survey that we did last year, where we surveyed 603 payroll managers, and 83% of those said their responsibilities have grown larger. 89% of them said they found awards and legislations difficult to interpret, and 67% thought they needed more training on technical aspects of payroll. So we know, not just anecdotally, but we know from the payroll community that payroll is difficult. But look, how hard is it really? And again, this is something that I just realized I've forgotten to start my video. There I am. I am actually real. I'm not tech support. I'll give you that. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at why payroll is so hard. So just to start with, there's a heap of internal payroll requirements that people who in payroll have to manage. It's company policy, it's governance controls, it's actually the payroll processing. And along with that, there's external requirements. And these are just some of the agencies and regulators and acts of parliament that payroll need to be aware of and manage externally. So that sort of gives you a bit of a holistic view about payroll's not just getting some timesheets and processing them and making payroll outputs. There's a much broader remit to payroll than just the processing of the pay. So let's look at the basics of payroll hard things. And as I said, I'm not going to be able to even touch the sides of all of the complexities of payroll, but I want to give you a feel. And for those of you, we've got a span of people on this call, everyone from incredibly experienced senior payroll managers through to people who have just recently joined the payroll industry, through to, I think we've got 700 people on this call. So we've got a big mix of different types of employers. So I just want to give you a feel for some of the basics of the hard things in payroll. The first thing I wanted to talk about was a span of hours, and this is covered in your award or agreement. And a span of hours is the ordinary hours that we expect employees to work for their ordinary pay. So an example of this, for example, I'll use the GRIA, the General Retail Award. The span of hours says that if you are a retailer, from Monday to Friday, from 7 a.m. till 9 p.m. is your standard, your span of hours. On Saturday, it's 7 o'clock in the morning till 6 at night, and on Sunday starts at 9 o'clock in the morning till 6 p.m. And that's pretty simple. However, you need to read all of your award and industrial agreement, because there may be exclusions or additions to that. And this is where awards get really tricky. It's not just the first line that will give you the answer. You've got to read the whole thing. And in the GRIA, it says, if you are a news agency, your span of hours start at 5 a.m. So reading those original span of hours wouldn't help you if you're a news agency. If you're a video shop, if those exist anymore, your span of hours will go till midnight. And your span of hours, no matter what retailer you are, they will go till 11 p.m. if the trading hours of the retailer are beyond 9 p.m. Monday to Friday, or 6 o'clock Saturday and Sunday. So you can imagine if you're a retailer and you're going into Christmas trading hours, your span of hours will change. So span of hours is not necessarily something that's fixed, especially if you're in the retail is a good example. I mean, I've got another example of this. We've got a client who has a span of hours that starts at 7 o'clock in the morning. But because of the type of industry they are and because of the type of workers they are, the workers prefer to start at 6:30 in the morning so they can leave early to go and do things in the afternoon, pick up children, whatever they want to do. They prefer to start at 6:30, but the span of hours is only from 7 o'clock. They've now got an underpayment issue because they should have been paying overtime for that 30 minutes of pay every single day. Every one of their employees came in at 6:30. Now, you can change span of hours, but you need to have agreement and documentation with your employees. And because our client didn't have that, they've discovered that they need to do quite a significant remediation back pay, which we're helping them with. So look, overtime's an interesting one. Let's look at the reasons that you could get overtime. And there are lots of reasons. There's the obvious ones. You work more than your ordinary hours that day. You work more than 38 hours in a week, for example. You work more than 76 hours in a fortnight. Or you work more than a specified number of hours in a roster cycle. Often overtime will be across roster cycles. It might be a 4-week or a 6-week roster cycle. You also could have worked outside the span of hours that we just talked about. You could have been called in when you're on call. You could be on an on-call shift where you're not working, but when you're called in, you might get overtime. You might be on a sleep hour shift and you're actually woken up to do some work, so that might attract overtime. If you're a part-timer, in some awards, if you work more than your part-time contracted hours, you get overtime. So if I'm a part-timer and I'm contracted to work 24 hours a week. If I work more than 24 hours a week, I get overtime. I don't have to wait till 38 hours. Now, that's for some awards in agreement, so make sure you check your industrial agreement. And you also can be paid overtime if you're on a salary, but you work outside the reasonable additional hours in your contract for your annualized salary. So there's lots of different reasons. Now, there's also specific reasons in awards that might not be general to most employees, only specific to those awards or EBAs. And here's a couple of examples. In the manufacturing award, it specifically calls out that if you are paid cash and you are kept waiting for your wages on a payday after your usual work time, when you've finished work, the employee that is waiting for their wages in cash is to be paid overtime for that period that they kept waiting. Who knew? People in manufacturing probably know, and if they don't, they do now. But there's all sorts of things all over awards and EBAs that might be additional overtime requirements. In the SHADS award, which is an incredibly commonly used award, there is on request, you can have your meal allowance paid as the same day as your overtime is worked. So watch out for that one as well. Now, there's a whole heap of things that are not overtime, and probably one of the most misunderstood overtime, not overtime examples is if you don't get a certain break between a shift. Now, this is very common, again, in retail, in hospitality, in healthcare. You might have a situation where your employees need to have a period break. It's normally either 10 or 12 hours. And if they don't get that break, then they need to be paid overtime until such time they have a break, except it's not overtime. If you actually or in general, it's not overtime. In fact, I'm yet to find an example that is overtime. For example, we'll use the Greer again because this is very common in a retail environment. You might have someone doing a stock take, might finish at midnight, and then might have to have their shift starting at 9 o'clock the next day. And they're required to have a 12-hour shift in general in retail, unless there's been an arrangement and an agreement between the employees and the employer. Now, commonly it's thought that the 200% is overtime, is double time, right? However, when you actually read the clause in the agreement in the modern award, it says if an employee starts work again without having the requisite 12 hours of off work, the employer must pay the employee at the rate of 200% that they would be entitled to, not overtime. It's a rate of 200% of ordinary hours. These are ordinary hours. They are not overtime hours. Now, the payslip totals will be correct, but if you just use an overtime code in payroll, say you're just paying double time, I mean, it's going to be the same monetary outcome. You'll actually be underpaying super and underpaying leave. And the same thing can happen with shift penalties. If you've got a 50% loading for weekend work or afternoon or evening shift, and you pay time and a half, exactly the same thing can happen. So an employer can avoid the 200% penalty. What you need to do is give the employee either their full break, so delay the start of the shift. Instead of starting at 9 o'clock, if I need a 10-hour break from midnight, you need to pay one ordinary hour from 9 till 10, and then it's just ordinary time for the rest of the shift. Otherwise, if you have them start at 9 o'clock, it is 200% of their ordinary rate for the entire shift, or until they get a requisite break as per your agreement. And in many wards, this is 10 hours. And also check your award, because it often applies only if an employee has worked overtime. So if they do overtime in the first shift, and that's the reason they didn't get their break, normally in this situation, it's a 10-hour break, the clause that you're looking for the award is normally called rest period after overtime. So make sure you have a look at that. And again, why is this critical? It's because the gross and the net pay will be correct, as 200% of ordinary is the same number as double time. However, because super is paid on ordinary hours, paying a double time code will underpay super as super is not paid on overtime. So if you're using an overtime code in payroll, you won't calculate the super. You'll be in breach of SG, and it's similar for leave accruals. So if you'll underpay your leave accruals, under accrue your leave if you don't get this right in payroll. And it's literally just a difference in code setup. So the other thing that is hard in payroll, and we often see get wrong, is do you tax a car or a phone allowance? And of course, the answer to this is it depends if it's expended in full. So payroll needs to tax this appropriately, but need the information as to whether this is expected to be expended in full. So you might have 2 car allowances in your payroll. One is taxed and one is non-taxed. You might have 2 phone allowance codes, for example. So it's not as simple as saying yes or no in some of these things. It depends on what the allowance is for. Now, cashing out annual leave. This is another one that is tricky, and we see often incorrectly done. I might have someone who would like to cash out 2 weeks of annual leave. Now, obviously, as long as they've got the rules around that, normally you need to have an accrual that's left over. You can't cash out to 0. So as long as all those conditions are met, how much do you pay if you want 2 weeks? Well, you pay the same as if the employee took the leave. So it's not just necessarily, it might be in a white collar environment, just 2 weeks of pay. But in environments where there are rosters and overtime that need to be considered, you need to take that into consideration when you're cashing out annual leave. Now, one of my favourite topics is long service leave. Not one of our help desk favourite topics, I might say. We are the only country in the world with long service leave. And the one thing about long service leave that I say all the time is that it is always calculated and paid in weeks. If your payroll system accrues long service leave in hours, please don't just pay what the payroll system calculates. You always must do a manual calculation and calculate it in weeks. I actually don't know a payroll system that can handle the accrual and calculation and payment of long service leave automatically. If we've got any vendors on the call who say that I think that they can do that, I'd be very happy to have a look. But there's so many complexities across the states and territories and so many rules around working patterns. It's very, very difficult, and I can't imagine that anyone would be able to automate this. All states and territories have their own Long Service Leave Act, and some states require that this weekly calculation is over a certain period. It could be it could be the last 12 months, it could be the last 5 years, it could be the whole of the work time that the employee has been there. And other states require an average hours calculation. So these calculations will be different depending on the state that the employee is in. Now, other things to consider is, the employee's current state of employment. Are they full-time? Are they part-time? Are they casual? What's their previous state of employment? Because long service leave doesn't matter whether you've gone from part-time to casual or back again and full-time. This will be relevant in a long service leave calculation. You need to consider the current and previous hours of work. Sometimes that might include overtime hours. Sometimes it might include the calculation of bonuses and commissions in the long service leave component of the weekly amount. We need to consider whether an employee is paid piece rates. And sometimes there are allowances that are included in long service leave calculations. So these are the sorts of things you need to consider and make sure that you are considering them in relation to the Act of Parliament in the state that your employee is working in. Obviously, there's different rules around unpaid leave and long service leave, particularly with the the latest updates in Victoria. So make sure that you've calculated or any periods of unpaid leave when you're looking at long service leave considerations. Now, for our friends in WA, this is only for you, but you might not be in WA, but you might have employees in WA. WA is different, and this is just one of the many, many things that can be different about different states and territories. In Western Australia, when you're averaging hours, you must include overtime hours, even for full-time employees. So what you can get to a position of in WA is you can have an average weekly hours worked more than 38 hours for long service leave. So that's something we see people getting caught out on all the time. Now, kilometre allowance. This is another reason that a really good example of why payroll can be hard. It's all these different agencies wanting different things. So, for example, the award rate might be 92 cents per kilometre. The tax office says the rate is 78 cents. So what do you pay? What you actually pay is 92 cents because that's what your award says that you need to pay. However, the tax office rate being 98 cents means 98 cents of the kilometres is tax-free, but the rest is taxable. So this is an example where we've got one condition from a Fair Work point of view, the other from the ATO's point of view. Fair Work sets out what you have to pay, and the ATO doesn't care what you pay, as long what they care about is it's taxed and reported correctly. So that's an example when people say, how much do you get paid for kilometres? It's not necessarily a simple answer. Now, the next thing I wanted to have a look at is termination. And specifically around termination, the difference between pension age and preservation age, and understanding this difference because it's regularly confused. So pension age is used to determine if an employee is eligible to receive the tax-free portion of a redundancy. So over pension age, there's no tax-free portion of the redundancy, you'll know that. But preservation age is used to determine the tax rate of an eligible termination payment or an ETP. So it'll either be 17% or 32%, and that will be determined based on the preservation age of the employee. People often confuse these two and use them incorrectly. So again, you just think it should be simple. Termination. Why is it so hard? This is why it's so hard. And these are just some of the reasons. Here's another one that's been in the news a bit recently, or in the last few years at least: superannuation on leave loading. Is it payable? Well, it depends. Leave loading is ordinary time earnings if the employee hasn't notionally given up the opportunity to work overtime. So if that is the case, super is payable. If they have given up the opportunity, super is not payable, because superannuation isn't paid on overtime, and leave loading in this respect is to compensate for an employee who takes leave and therefore not working, which means they can't do overtime shifts, which they would otherwise do regularly. I hope that makes sense. So it's not enough just to say that leave loading is paid for the loss of opportunity to work overtime, though. You can't just say, well, I don't think Tracy normally works overtime, or she does. It's got to be clearly documented and demonstrated. So in terms of being defensible, look at your award, look at your EA, look at your roster patterns, look at your company policy, look at the employee's contract. These are the way. You can't just make a determination. You've got to have some sort of defendable work documentation to show whether super's payable on leave loading, because obviously if you don't pay it correctly, you will be in breach of the Super Guarantee Act. Excuse me, I'm talking very fast because I know we've only got 40 minutes together today, and I wanted to get through a few more things about why payroll is so hard. Working through a meal break. This says you got to imagine you're in the pay office and someone works through a meal break. Now, there's a penalty loading that only applies if they don't take a break, which is the employer's discretion. But how is payroll able to determine if an employee works through their meal break and why they did so? Because the penalty loading only applies if it's at the employee's discretion, not if the employee decides they won't take a break, payroll will need this information as to not just that there's a penalty being paid, but why the meal break wasn't taken in order to pay correctly. So payroll need to get this information, why the meal break wasn't taken. Was it at the employer's discretion or the employee's discretion? And that will determine whether this penalty is payable. Now, putting all this together, I wanted to give you an example of redundancy, and this really will give you a good indication of why payroll is so hard. And there are hundreds of other examples. I just wanted to give you as many as I could in the 40 minutes that we had together today. So here's an example of a fortnightly paid employee who has been made redundant. They have in the fortnight that the last fortnight that they worked, 1 week of that was they had workers' comp. So they've got a week of workers' comp in their final pay. The second week of the last fortnight, they worked just as they would ordinarily. They're a long-serving employee. They've worked, so they've got some long service leave. They're aged over 45, so on redundancy, they're entitled to an additional week's pay in lieu of notice. So rather than 4 weeks in lieu of notice, they get 5. They've got 12 weeks owing long service leave that they haven't taken. They've got 3 weeks of accrued annual leave, and they've got a redundancy entitlement, which is also in weeks. So this is the really simple scenario of, or really not simple, but common scenario of a redundancy. So let's have a look at that. The one thing I was going to say is all of these things in this fortnightly example are talking about weeks. What's a week's pay? And this is a really good example of why payroll is complex and hard. Of the hundreds of awards and enterprise agreements and acts of parliament that make up our industrial relations framework in Australia, you'd think it would be a simple question, but it's not. What's a week's pay? So let's have a look at this example of how you might calculate this week's pay. So the first thing is they worked a week of workers' compensation in the final pay. So a week for workers' compensation is a standalone calculation. And again, this differs from states and territories. So check your rules for your applicable state. I won't go through all of the state rules today, but suffice to say it's a separate calculation that you need to do. Now, the second week of their final fortnight, they worked. So as the final week of pay is likely to be based on the hours worked during that week, it will need to include whatever the penalties and allowances and overtime that would have been worked. But that's different from the in lieu and notice, which we'll go through shortly. As I say, this employee is aged over 45, so they're entitled to 5 weeks in lieu of notice. And in lieu of notice includes the loadings and penalties and allowances and overtime that the employee would have been paid had they worked those 5 weeks. So you need to have a look at what was the employee due to work in the next 5 weeks to determine the value of the week's pay, and in this case, the 5 weeks pay in lieu of notice. And as I say, because this employee is aged over 45, they're entitled to that additional week. So the 12 weeks long service leave, and as I've said before, a week's pay for long service leave needs to be a separate calculation, as every state has got different inclusions. So this calculation is also complicated by employment type, leave without pay during the period of service, any breaks in service, any periods of interstate or overseas service. So these are the things you've got to have a look back on to that employee to make sure this calculation of the 12 weeks is accurate. And depending on the state and territory, there might be a need to be a comparison, for example, of the value of the week. It could be the last 12 months, it could be the last 5 years, or it could be across the whole range of service, as I've said earlier. So depending on the state, you'll need to look at the Long Service Leave Act, or if hopefully you've got some sort of cheat sheet. We've got some like that is just like a matrix with all the different rules for long service leave. Now you've got this 3 weeks of accrued annual leave. This might seem quite straightforward. But the accrued annual leave, it might attract a 17.5% leave loading if this employee is entitled to it. But what needs to be considered is whether the employee where the employee was scheduled to work in the next in those 3 weeks, because they might have an afternoon shift or a night shift or Saturdays or Sundays. And if that's the case, you need to make a calculation of the penalties that relate to those shifts. And that will depend on your award or agreement, of course, and that they'll be paid the greater of those penalties or the 17.5%. So you can see that that's another calculation. And then you've got a redundancy entitlement in weeks. So a week's pay for redundancy purposes is based on the employee's base pay rate. And that excludes loadings, penalties, allowances, and overtime. However, if this is someone who works variable ordinary hours, so it could be a part-timer that works sort of up and down casual variable hours, or it could even be a full-timer that works variable hours, a further calculation needs to be done to determine exactly what hours are worked. So you can see that just from, a relatively common redundancy example, you've got 6 different types of weeks or 6 different types of payments in this redundancy, all talked about in weeks and all potentially having different valuations. So as I say, it is common from a redundancy point of view. There's 6 calculations, all valued differently. You've got your payout of annual leave and leave loading. You've got your long service leave. You've got your in lieu of notice. You've got your actual redundancy pay. You've got your workers' compensation in this example and their final week's pay. Some of these payments will attract superannuation. Some of them do not. Some of these payments attract additional leave accruals and some of them don't. Some of these payments are taxed concessionally, some are not. Some of these payments are tax-free, in fact, based on how long the employees work for, and some are not. And this is just one redundancy pay. This is just one example. So it's one of my favorite examples because it does just show how complicated payroll can be and is regularly. So I wanted to have a look at what else makes payroll difficult. It's not just the award and agreement, industrial relations environment. It's things like your colleagues asking, should we just outsource the payroll? So I think about this as, as a bad singer, giving them a microphone. if I'm a bad singer, giving me a microphone is just going to make the pain bigger. It's going to amplify the pain. So if you've got issues in your payroll, whatever they might be, just outsourcing it is just going to amplify that pain, both to the employer, to the employees, and the payroll department. So think carefully when your executives ask you, or perhaps ask them to think carefully, whether they should just outsource their payroll. It might be a great strategy for you, but you need to understand why you want to outsource. People ask me all the time, what's the best payroll system? When all these underpayments happen and are in the papers, it's always the system that gets the blame. So what's the best system? Well, of course, it depends on what your requirements are, what type of employees you've got, the demographics, where they are. Are they, do they sit in front of a computer all day, or are they, digging ditches? I have no idea. That question needs to be reframed. The question is not what's the best payroll system. It's what's the best payroll system for my employer. And that's the question we should be asking. So blaming technology is often a real, makes payroll very hard. And the other thing that a lot of CFOs and HR directors ask me is, how do I even know what I'm signing off is correct? And that is a symptom of payroll being really difficult. And I encourage payroll managers and payroll teams to provide the evidence that gives the confidence in the person signing off the payroll that the payroll is correct. Now, of course, best practice is around people, processes, and technology. You've probably heard me talk about this before. People, we want competent, trained, supported people, ideally with a minimum qualification of a certificate for and payroll administration. We want great processes with good governance and controls. Everyone who works in payroll should be above suspicion of doing anything fraudulent. And if they are not, your processes and controls are not good enough. If you're using paper and spreadsheets and manual calculations outside of the things we've talked about today, we can improve the processes. And of course, technology needs to be fit for purpose, great employee experience, and configured correctly, because you can see just from today that twice a standard rate, twice the ordinary time rate versus double time are two very different things in how they're calculated in payroll, and how they calculate leave accruals, and how they calculate super. As I said, Cert 4 in payroll administration is the gold standard in terms of making sure you've got a competent team. Obviously, we provide that. That's a little bit of telling them what we do. I think it's a fantastic operational payroll certificate, and it's competency based. That's the most important thing. And a lot of our students go on to do the diploma of payroll management as well. Please support your team with making sure they have up-to-date knowledge on payroll. There is just no way that you can deliver confidence in how people get paid if your team are not trained properly. So, you can go to us, you can go to other organizations. I just make sure you get that training. We have, payroll essentials to advanced payroll. We've got specialist master classes. I run the Payroll Leadership Academy from time to time, which I see unbelievable outcomes from. We've got a new course on modern awards, and we're doing specialty courses as well. We're doing even a SHADS award, because a SHADS award course, because we see so many issues with the SHADS award, and we'll be doing more. But maybe the biggest thing you can do for your team and to support your payroll team, and I know we've got many members on this webinar, is to arrange payroll membership for a couple of dollars a day, $2 or $3 a day. You can get access to our help desk team, to our portal. Funny, just before we started this webinar, my members update came through on an email. So these are the things that are in our December 22 members update. New family and domestic violence leave, Queensland payroll tax, mental health levy, changes to the Children's Services Award, 15 changes the aged care award, changes to public holidays. So these are the things that we are proactively providing to our members to make sure they've got all the up-to-date information that they need. If you do, and many of you will be members, and hopefully you'll use this. This is our knowledge portal. This is a really great resource for with all things payroll. I mean, this is what's in it. There's just so much stuff in here. If you don't want to make a call, you don't want to call the Fair Work, you don't want to call the tax office, come here. Probably the tool and the calculators and the resources will be here. Wouldn't that have been a helpful little template for that redundancy example that I gave earlier? You could just come into our members portal, download the redundancy template, put the figures in, and don't worry about anything else, because we've set up this redundancy calculator that it knows all the rules and will do that for you. So it's my favorite little tool in the toolbox. We've also got monthly members webinars and a gallery of a library of all the old webinars, because they don't necessarily go out of date. So we've got, again, it's a library of these things. And what I'd love to offer you today, and we're 3 minutes out, so of the 40 minutes that I promised, is if you are not a member, I'd really love you to be, because the most important thing that we can do to provide confidence in how people get paid in Australia is to support payroll teams in Australia to make sure that they have instant access to the knowledge that they need to provide compliant payroll. Now, until the end of the year, we're very happy to give anyone who's not a member a 10% discount on our membership. Just use the discount code Tracy. I've made it as simple as possible. You can then get, 360, well, not 365 days, but a year's worth of access to our help desk, who are real people. We will normally either if we don't answer your question straight away, something like 99% of questions are answered within 2 hours. The only reason that it wouldn't be is if we have to go to a regulator to get further information or a ruling. You also, again, have access to that portal that I showed you with a heap of resources and webinars and calculators. That's available 24/7. Hopefully you're not doing payroll outside of normal working hours, but we know many of our members do, and they really love that self-service support. So I'll send you an email. We actually don't have time for questions. I do see a couple in the Q&A, and I will check that. But with so many people on the call, it's probably not a great idea. But if you do have a question, I will send you an email this afternoon with a link to the recording of this webinar if you'd like to rewatch it or share it. I think maybe your boss needs to see it, because it's, and as I say, this is only the tip of the iceberg stuff. I'll also send you details of a webinar that Jasmine, my colleague Jasmine, is doing in a few weeks. And it's a complimentary webinar, not just to our members. And it's on all the things you need to know for 2023. If you've got any questions, then you'll have my direct email. It's coming. I'll email it to you directly. It won't come from a system. So if you've got any questions on any of the content or any of our services, just reply to my email. I'll be very happy to talk to you. And if you've got a member, of course, if you are a member, of course, you've already got access to the help desk and our fantastic team anytime. Thank you for, let me just check the Q&A in case there's something important in there. Someone has written in the comments, remind me why on earth I do payroll. It's too hard. It is hard, but gee, it's interesting. There's nothing boring about it. Someone also has asked me when the 2022 benchmarking report will be released. That's a very good question, and one that my team are asking me as well. We will be releasing a 2023 payroll survey in February 2023, so look out for that. Thank you for joining me. It is now 40 minutes. I'm about to turn into a pumpkin. Lovely to have you all on this webinar. I look forward to seeing you in person very soon.